The embargo has lifted, my friends, and now I can finally reveal to you that yes, I have played Shadow of the Erdtree in a church in Paris with a life-sized statue of Messmer looming behind me, judging my every move. And in this video, I'm going to break down absolutely everything you could possibly want to know about what could potentially be the best DLC I have ever played for any game ever. Trust me, this is no exaggeration. You will also see that I have put very clear chapters in this video for those of you who don't want to be spoiled. So if you only want to see certain details, please feel free to skip to these specific segments that interest you. And then, once you've realized that you are far more excited about all of this information than you ever thought possible, you can go back, restart the video, and just watch the whole thing anyway. Alright, no more stalling. Let's give you everything that you came here for, starting with what level you should be, how difficult the DLC actually is, what is this new level scaling mechanic that people keep talking about, and how does it all work? Even though the footage you are seeing here today isn't my own, I would like to let you know that the developers did start us at level 150 for the purposes of our play session. This seems to be a good recommendation, however they did advise if you've got a good build and you are confident in your abilities, you could attempt as early as level 100 to 120. And for those of you that are thinking, but I thought our levels didn't matter and it was going to have a different level scaling thing implemented in the DLC. That does exist, and I'll touch on that in just a second, but the focus of this new mechanic is the damage that you deal and the damage that you receive. All other stats are still entirely dictated by your own character. So, the higher level you are coming into this DLC, the easier it will be naturally, because of all of the other mechanics that will still be in play. If you increase your mind, naturally you'll be able to cast more spells and use more buffs. If you increase your endurance, you'll be able to wear heavier armor. All of these things are still entirely unaffected. And as for the new quote-unquote level scaling mechanic, this is entirely optional, and if you're worried that this will make the game too easy, you can simply ignore it. So how this new mechanic works is you will collect Erdtree fragments. Once you have collected enough fragments, you can rest at any site of grace and there will be a new option to increase the level of your Erdtree blessing. This will both increase your damage dealt and reduce your damage received. Please bear in mind, these aren't the only things that will increase your damage dealt and reduce your damage received. Obviously, if you go in with all of your stats at 99 and all of your weapons maxed out, you're still going to do far more damage than a level 1. But if you want the easiest time, you will combine your levels with the new Erdtree blessing mechanic. Otherwise, you're effectively playing on hard mode. Another question people will probably have about these Erdtree blessings before we move on is, where do you find them? Think of them somewhat similarly to golden seeds or sacred tears. They aren't quite as specifically placed as the other two items I have just mentioned, but they will often be in key locations, and they are scattered everywhere. So you really want to search off of the beaten path if you want to fully max out your Erdtree blessing and give you the best chance of defeating the DLC. For instance, if you find an encampment of knights and there is a mini-boss there, chances are there will be a Erdtree fragment not too far away. As for the difficulty of the enemies, their health pools, the damage they deal, they are very, very powerful. Don't get me wrong, there is a wide variety of enemy types, and some of them, even though their damage is high and their health is high, they are obviously still considered trash mobs. You're going to have lots of mindless humanoids wandering around, and though they will take a beating, they won't pose any kind of a challenge. But be warned, because even minor enemies can pose a threat to you due to their significantly increased health and damage pools. For instance, just after you grasp the arm protruding from the cocoon and enter into the Land of Shadow, shortly after lighting your first Sight of Grace, if you wander too far to the southeast, this kung fu wielding humanoid bird thing will jump down at you and probably kick your ass, because enemies in the DLC are bloody tough. From my experience, scaling starts around the same difficulty of the mountaintops of the giants. So most people will want to use this optional but very powerful Erdtree blessing mechanic. Now that you know about that, let's talk about the length of the DLC. It's very tough, as I'm sure you're all aware, to give you a specific number of hours for a From Software game. So what I'll do instead is I'll give you a few reference points that you can use to judge against your own playthrough. Firstly, it was confirmed to us by the staff at the event that there is more than 10 major bosses, and this is the largest From Software expansion ever created. In our 4-hour play session, I felt like I had barely scratched the surface of the first region, which contains 2 of the new major bosses. I estimate this area will take around 15 to 20 hours to fully comb through, and I'm assuming you can probably times that figure by around 5 to get the length of the full expansion. Another great metric is the soundtrack length. As we know, the soundtrack length of the base game is around 3.5 hours at 66 tracks long. And according to the From Software Twitter page a few weeks ago, the DLC will have more than 30 new soundtracks. So you can guess it's roughly half of the main game. So if the main game took you 150 hours to complete, the DLC will probably take you around 75, maybe plus a few more just because of the difficulty, so you will likely be attempting some bosses a few more times than you would the base game. Now feel free to skip the rest of this section if you don't want any story spoilers, because I will just be lightly touching on the story as another indicator of the length of the game. As you are entering into the DLC and interacting with the first few NPCs, you quickly find out that your primary purpose here, the main quest, is to find out why Miquella stripped himself of his titles and his power and ventured through into the lands of Shadow. In the first region, I met around 10 NPCs, all of whom gave me tiny bits of information, all revolving around Miquella's quest and their goal to help him and find out exactly what he is doing and why. And it feels like in all of these interactions, during my 4 hours of gameplay, I barely scratched the surface and I barely found out anything. So I can imagine this is literally only 1 or 2% into the DLC, and this could easily be 100 hours long should you wish to comb through everything. Now for the segment I have been most excited to share with you. In no particular order, I shall now take you through the 8 new weapon categories, and everything I know about them so far. The developers very kindly gave us 3 entirely different builds that we could run through our play session with. And between the 3, they contained at least one of all 8 types of new weapons. We had a dexterity-based knight, a strength-focused warrior, and a faith-int hybrid sorcerer. I was immediately drawn to the sorcerer, as the sorcerer was wielding one of the new martial arts hand-to-hand weapons, and this is something I have been praying for since Elden Ring first came out. Though I knew I wasn't really going to do all that much magic, and I also knew I've completed a bunch of challenge runs, so I am very familiar with this game. So whilst everyone else was sprinting into the DLC, I decided to open up my map, teleport to Renala, and take a few minutes to respec. And as you'll find out later on in the video, this served me very well, as I believe I was able to beat the most bosses in my play session, with 5 out of the 6 I encountered being taken down by the end of the 4 hours. So I left a few stats in Faith and Int just so I could try out some of the new spells, which I'll talk about later, but I primarily focused on a quality build, and I applied new ashes to my hand-to-hand weapons, giving them both poison and rot damage, and I'll talk about that right now because it is absolutely insane and you are all gonna lose your minds, trust me. So, the hand-to-hand weapons, this is the style I used the most during our play session, and it's probably my second favourite of the new weapon types. I genuinely found it so insanely fun. You do need to remember to switch to two-handed mode first. the same way as if you were using a weapon only in your right hand and you two-handed it. Even though there isn't much visual difference, if you are technically one-handing your hand-to-hand martial arts, you will just be swinging around one fist, and it is nowhere near as effective. So, once you have two-handed whatever martial arts weapon you currently have equipped, you become a force to be reckoned with. The kicks especially, such as jumping heavy attacks, are absolutely lethal. And in turn, they make you feel like an absolute badass. As I mentioned, I respec'd my weapon very early on. I acquired and applied a new weapon art to my hand-to-hand weapon called the Poison Flower Blooms Twice. This is an awesome aerial plunging kick, kind of akin to Kami's Cannon Strike or the Spiral Arrow from Street Fighter, and it also applies Scarlet Rot on hit. Bearing in mind I said earlier I gave it poison build-up as well, this weapon art also has an additional effect. If the enemy you're attacking is already poisoned or rotted, when you next hit them with the Poison Flower Blooms Twice, it will use up the remainder of your poison or rot effect and deal a huge amount of instant burst damage. So if you combo this with a really poison or rot heavy build, you can just keep spamming and reapplying this effect again and again for huge damage. And using this combo, I was able to easily take down the Dancing Lion on my first attempt, but I'll talk about him more later. The next new weapon category is the Throwing Blade. This came in the form of two weapons during our play session, the Smith Script Axe and the Smith Script Dagger. And what more can I say really, it's exactly as it sounds. It's a melee weapon which you can throw. And once you have thrown it, it will instantly reappear in your hand, so you can throw it again. And you can just keep spamming this weapon at lightning speed. I'm so excited to see what people can do with throwing blades, and what more variations of throwing blades will be on offer as we progress through the DLC. Because it just seems like such an insanely powerful weapon. I mean, think about it. It's a way to give pure strength builds a really powerful ranged option. What is not to like about that thought? Next up, have you ever thought, greatswords are slightly too slow and clunky for me, I like a quicker weapon, but when I use a straight sword, it hits like a wet noodle. Let me introduce to you the light greatsword. I strongly believe this is the best of both. It could have gone either way, it could have been the worst of both, but genuinely it's only a smidge heavier than a straight sword, with a moveset that's nearly as fast, whilst also being not quite as powerful as a greatsword, which makes it pretty much the best of both. The light greatsword is as strong as it bloody well sounds. It's an absolutely awesome weapon category, which I'm sure will be the focal point of a lot of quality builds in the future. And also, the weapon art that we had on the light greatsword that was given to us was called Wing Stance, and you can see it in action here. You ready it up similar to Unsheath, and then you can follow up with two very different and equally powerful movesets. As is suggested by the name Wing Stance, you move almost like the birds in the game, flowing around from left to right, and partially nullifying their guards and their defenses. The next one, unfortunately I forget if this is the name of the weapon or the weapon category, but it is the Backhand Blade. This was actually my favourite of the 8 new weapon categories, especially the specific weapon art that came with the Backhand Blade that we were given. But I'll come back to the art in just a second. The blade itself is awesome. Even though it is only one blade, if you two-hand it, it will split into dual swords, and oh my god are they fast. It has an insanely cool moveset that will be incredible for status effect heavy builds, because the power and speed with which this weapon attacks means that you will be applying build-ups so quickly. I applied bleed to mine, and I was proccing bleed with nearly every single combo. As for the weapon art itself, the one that I was able to use during the play session is called Blind Spot. And with one single press of your weapon art button, you will spin 180 degrees behind the enemy you're locked onto and immediately hit them in the back with just one button press. Now, bearing in mind, this isn't a backstab in the same way that you would plunge your sword into your enemy and kick them to the ground if they're unaware, but it is still a dodge plus a back attack with literally one single button press. And when you get good at timing this, should you wish, it can easily replace both dodge and parry, and it's the only defensive ability that you will need, and it comes with an offensive attack tagged on the end. So it's literally a win-win. Next up, and the weapon type I'm gutted I didn't get more chance to use, is the Great Katana. It really interests me and it sounds incredible, but there was just so much that I wanted to try and so little time that I simply didn't have time to test out everything. The one thing I can tell you about the Great Katana is that it feels so Sekiro by letting you do a proper upgraded Ichimonji attack. Akin to the meteoric ore blade from the base game, but so much bigger, so much better, and way more impactful. I imagine the Great Katana is going to be a huge fan favorite just because of how stylish it is. Next up, we have got the Beast Claw. To me, at first, this one seemed a bit gimmicky. I was worried that it was just fists, but with extra unnecessarily complicated steps, and it was very showy-offy. However, it actually has a very awesome moveset. My god, it looks so sick, but admittedly, it is very tough to use, it's very unwieldy, and it is all too easy to accidentally leave yourself open to attack. So this is going to be a real sleeper weapon with an exceptionally high skill ceiling, and I imagine probably devastating in PvP because of how erratic it is. It wasn't my favorite at first, but it could be absolutely lethal given time, patience, and practice. The 7th weapon category is the Perfume Bottle. Just like the Perfumer enemies in the base game, you can now spam your own Perfumer Bottle to your heart's content. The base one that we had to try out didn't do much poise damage from my initial testing, but admittedly I didn't base my build around this weapon, I was just messing around with it. So maybe it is more powerful than I initially thought, and also I'm sure you'll find some super powerful versions of this new weapon type in the latter parts of the DLC. Though it does seem as though this new category is built more around taking down large groups of smaller enemies rather than focusing big foes one-on-one, as it has a huge damage arc and various elemental damage types depending on which bottle you have equipped. Definitely a very, very fun weapon, and I love this addition to the game. It's one I really hope people can make work, and it will be great for Perfumer cosplays. And finally, we've got the Thrusting Shield. A shield that's also a weapon. Is it the best of both, or is it the worst of both? I'm not going to lie to you, my friends, this is the only new weapon type I wasn't blown away by. It states that you can attack and defend at the same time, yet from my testing with the moveset, I did seem to only be able to do one or the other, and it was quite lackluster at both. Though, as I say, we had literally 4 hours to do so many things, so maybe I just haven't given this a fair go yet. I really hope to be proven wrong by someone else, and that there is a way to use this weapon that I missed, which makes it really, really powerful. But my initial impression is that this is the only underwhelming category of all of the new weapon types, and not one I'm excited to jump back into again soon. But mainly, that's through no fault of the Thrusting Shield, that's because the others are insanely cool. Just before we get into the NPCs, I'd like to remind everyone that the DOMS Roundtable community does have our own group password in-game. It's Knights, all in caps, as we are the Knights of the Round Table after all. And talking of our community, I may be a bit biased, but I genuinely believe this is the most helpful community I have ever had the pleasure to be a part of. Both in-game and in our Discord server, the link to that is below, people are consistently helping each other out. The amount of bosses I've helped the community defeat and the plethora of helpful messages left on the ground are just some of the reasons I love this community. Everyone is so insanely helpful and supportive, and I know I've personally been thanked hundreds of times for getting people through this game, and I'm sure others have been too. So get the group password set up, click the link in the description to join the Discord, and let's engage in some jolly cooperation. Next up, I'll briefly introduce you to the many new NPCs that I met, but don't worry people who don't want spoilers because I know very little about any of them. As always with FromSoft, it was super vague, especially in the early game. Firstly, before you even enter the DLC, waiting by the Site of Grace after you have defeated Moog the Lord of Blood will be Lady Leda. She will introduce herself before you enter the DLC and talks about following Miquella the Kind into the Land of Shadow to help assist him and find out his true intentions. Throughout the areas in the DLC, you will be fighting the Black Knights, who were Messmer's army, and one such knight is Black Knight Commander Andreas. Andreas was the first leader of the Black Knights, and he will eventually be available to you as a Spirit Ash summon, wielding a huge Great Hammer in one hand and a Great Shield in the other, also using various offensive faith spells. He is a very powerful Spirit Ash, which you can buff up even further using one of the DLC's new mechanics, which I shall talk about shortly. Next up, I had a brief interaction with Ansbach. Formerly in the service of Lord Moog, he now dedicates himself to discovering kindly Miquella's purpose in the Land of Shadow, and accompanying Ansbach was Mor. Mor is very reminiscent of the Onion Knight. I believe this is probably a direct nod to the Onion Knights from the Souls games. He travels with Ansbach and has a shop. Definitely an oafish, friendly giant type personality, with very few wants and needs in the world, aside from protecting Ansbach and gathering things. My favourite voice line from the preview event comes from Mor, as he talks about collecting things and how everyone loves having things. And specifically, he says, "Things bring joy to all." I could not agree more, my friends. We all love things. You will also face off against another Carian knight, Moonrathil. Moonrathil is introduced to you when she comes charging at you with her giant troll greatsword. She is a fearsome foe who took me down a few times, and she is guarding one of the main bosses of the DLC, R'Larna, the Twin Moon Knight. The relationship between Moonrathil and R'Larna very much reminds me of the relationship between Moongrum and Renala. Obviously, this is entirely intentional, as evidenced even just by their names alone. Caria and the Carian Knights definitely have a big presence in the DLC, just as they did in the base game, and I'm so excited to learn more about the Carian royal family and how Moonrathil and R'Larna fit into that. Next up, we have Tolier. You learn very little about Tolier, other than that they don't really think very much of themselves. They're very shy and very timid, and actually really reminded me of Taupes. Not having faith in their own abilities, saying that they are weak and they're not very intelligent. However, the one thing that Tolier is sure of is their proficiency over poison, as is evidenced by their shop, full of many offensive and defensive poison-themed items, including a new poison version of the brand new Perfumer bottle weapon type. And the location in which you first meet Tolier, they are surrounded by various poison swamps. Yay, more poison swamps in a FromSoft game! Next up, trapped down in the darkest depths at the bottom of the castle settlement of Belurat, was the demi-human swordmaster Onza and his apprentice Yosh. Onza studied the way of the Starry Blade, an art I am hoping we will learn a lot more about as we travel through the Shadow of the Erdtree, as he uses this awesome attack, which is very reminiscent of a frost version of the waterfowl dance. Once you defeat Onza, you will receive Yosh's Spirit Ash as a reward. Yosh was Onza's apprentice and a fellow study of the Starry Blade. And finally, I also encountered Logur the Beast Claw. Rather than being an invader, such as the likes of Anastasia, or an invasion, like Magnus the Beast Claw, Logur is simply walking around the world. And you do hear an ominous noise when you are close to him, and though when I met him, he was instantly hostile to me and we did have to fight to the death, the fact that there was an audio cue beforehand reminded me of the first time you hear Blythe howling in Mistwood, and it made me think perhaps there's more to Logur's story and you may not have to fight him if you perform the correct steps after hearing him for the first time. Another brand new mechanic to go side by side with the Scadutree Blessing is Revered Spirit Ashes. Both of these new mechanics are only operational in the Shadow of the Erdtree, so that you're not then ridiculously overpowered when you go back to the base game. Revered Spirit Ashes do two different things. They will not only boost the attack power of your Spirit Ashes and your summons beyond +10, so that they can continue scaling with you in the DLC, but they will also boost your Spectral Steed's abilities. Now, we can safely assume that when they say Spectral Steed, they're talking about Torrent. And Torrent plays a huge role in the DLC. By increasing your level of Revered Spirit Ashes, you will increase Torrent's health and durability, meaning you can stay mounted in combat for far longer. I believe the reason for this is because there is going to be a heavy influence on mounted combat in the DLC, as evidenced by the Furnace Golem. The Furnace Golem, I believe, is a main major boss later on in the DLC. However, as we know from some of the trailers, there is actually tons of Furnace Golems, and there is one of them wandering around right in front of you as you first enter the DLC. And it is practically impossible to fight him unless you are a top Torrent. And this is where the Revered Spirit Ashes come into play. They are going to mean Torrent is more durable and you can stay mounted for a longer period of time, meaning this fight becomes significantly easier. As I say, it also boosts the attack power of your Spirit Ashes, and from our play session, I already know of 3 brand new Spirit Ashes. I already mentioned Black Knight Commander Andreas with his huge hammer and great shield. You can also summon a brand new enemy type, the Revered. These things are very, very cool. They're not particularly powerful to fight, but they have some really annoying moves, and they're just as annoying for your enemies when you summon one. And finally, something I have been praying and praying we would get. You can summon a Finger Creeper. This, to me, is kind of like the new Dung Eater. It's the tankiest thing I have ever summoned. It just will not die. Every time I died, the Finger Creeper outlasted me without fail. It doesn't do all that much damage, but it's great at getting enemies' attention, and it will always stick by your side and try and block attacks. Alongside that, it will stick its middle finger up in the air and project a healing aura. So a very tanky, very support-heavy Spirit Ash, and one that is a lot of fun to use. Now I shall talk you through some of the bosses of the DLC. In the first area we had access to, I found 6 bosses, though I'm sure there are probably way more than that. I know for a fact there are at least 2 caves I left completely unexplored, and I didn't even consider potential nighttime bosses. With that being said, the first boss that most of us encountered as we just beelined straight towards it was the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. I was hoping to absolutely love this fight, and it lived up to my every expectation. Oh my god, he is so cool. A very, very fast boss, flies around the arena at the speed of light during some of his attacks. And as the fight progresses, he is starting to incorporate more and more elements into his fighting style, starting to use lightning and other elemental attacks. As he channels many different elements, it makes it very hard for one particular build to counter him, meaning you'll need to rely much more on your own skills as a player and just plenty of practice dodging his crazy range of devastatingly fast attacks. Due to the fact that he can wield so many elements, I got real Kujata vibes from Final Fantasy, and once you defeat him, as with all main bosses, you can hand in his Remembrance to Enya. Both of the rewards from his Remembrance surprised me greatly. First up is a talisman that increases the potency of storms. Now, I wasn't sure exactly what this meant at first when it just said storms. However, luckily we had many of the team on hand to ask for help, and after requesting clarification, they did confirm it simply means any storm attack, of which there aren't that many in the base game. So hopefully this means they will be expanding on the amount of storm-based weapons and weapon arts in the DLC to make this talisman really viable. His other reward is a new Ash of War, the Divine Beast Frost Stomp. I didn't get a chance to try this one out, but I'm assuming it's a variation of the Hoarfrost Stomp from the base game, maybe with higher damage and a wider arc, based on the gigantic moves that the Dancing Lion used during the fight itself. And on top of this, you get his literal head as a new helmet. It is enormous, and it looks both ridiculous and amazing at the same time. It doesn't even shrink down to fit the size of your character. You're literally wearing a head about 4 times as big as you on your own head. It's so silly. And this will increase your strength and dex by 2, but for a trade-off of reducing the restoration done by your flasks. I didn't get a chance to read the full description of the item, but I like to think the reason it reduces the restoration done by your flasks is because as you're trying to pour them in your face, half of it's just sliding down the mask and missing your mouth. Next up, as I mentioned earlier, wandering menacingly around the middle of the zone, giving off giant tree sentinel vibes, is a Furnace Golem. Now, this isn't the proper Furnace Golem boss from the trailer. He's probably nowhere near as powerful. However, he is still insanely tough and gave a lot of people trouble, so most people just avoided him. I believe I may be the only person in my play session of 20 people who actually managed to beat him. And I do have a very effective strat, but I don't want to give away all of my secrets just yet. So you'll have to wait until the game comes out and I start to release my guides to learn more about how to tackle him and some of the other bosses and enemies. Anyway, once you have defeated him, he will drop a new tier for your mixed physic. This is the deflecting hard tier, and this will boost what the game calls your spontaneous guard. From my understanding, this is when you block at the last second. So not a parry, simply a block, but a very last minute guard. And when you do this, it will activate the deflecting hard tier, which will then increase your damage negation and your guard poise for a period of time, basically making you naturally more tanky and making your future guarding more effective. Also, to make sure you stay up to date for all of the hundreds of the Shadow of the Erdtree videos I have coming, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Next up, but in no particular order, was the Ghost Flame Dragon. There isn't much to say about this one. It has a very similar moveset to most other dragons, except he can spew Ghost Flame around him. Kind of like Xeeks, but nowhere near as terrifying. And by now, as I'm sure we all are, I'm very familiar with dragon enemies, so I killed him with no issues on my first try, as I'm sure most people will. Also, I tend to really love massive enemies in this game, like the dragons, like the dancing lion, so I'm super happy for them to put more of them in the DLC. And it was really cool to see a dragon whilst wandering around in the open world, and it was a fun fight. Also, this dragon confirmed for me that there are more ancient smithing stones in the game. This dragon in particular dropped an ancient somber smithing stone, and I'm assuming that means there is also more ancient smithing stones to be acquired as well, which means per playthrough we can max out even more weapons than we could before. The next boss, who I mentioned in my NPC section, is Demi-Human Swordmaster Onza. As mentioned in the NPC section, you will face him right at the bottom of the castle settlement of Bellarat. And from what I could see, there is not a single site of grace on your way down here, and it is a long, tough way down. So you will most likely be getting there completely out of healing items, though luckily there is a stake of Marika, so even if you do die, you'll just respawn with all of your stuff, and he is actually super easy to beat. I effectively no-hit him. He's got some cool moves, but as he is a very tiny demi-human, he's a complete pushover and you can effectively just stun-lock him to death. Though I really did love his animations and his story, and I'm so excited to hopefully find out more about the way of the Starry Blade and uncover more of the story behind the demi-humans in the Land of Shadow. I also encountered a Black Knight in a jail. Unfortunately, I do forget his exact name, though the entrance to this jail was more reminiscent of the Mad Pumpkinhead duo or the Royal Revenant. It was a mini dungeon of sorts just beneath the surface, rather than the jails that we're used to from the base game that teleport you. However, just like the other jails, same rules apply, no summons, which makes this fight insanely difficult. He has a great sword with a weapon art very similar to the Moonveil, so you can imagine already how deadly that is in melee, or even if you try and distance yourself from it. But then, if you get too far away, he switches to this new type of repeater crossbow, which can shoot a flurry of around a dozen crossbow bolts at once. And if even one of them hits you, the rest will easily stun-lock you and almost definitely kill you. So without any summons at all, this is a devastatingly hard fight because you effectively have to no-hit him, because as soon as you get stuck in one of his combos, it's game over. After a couple of attempts of getting him down to a tiny sliver of health, I realized I needed to call it a day and move on because there is so much more that I wanted to explore. Again, as already mentioned, I faced off against Moonrithil, basically a stronger version of Moongrum. She is a very intimidating Carian knight, and some people may just want to run past her to the next boss and come back and fight her when you're a bit stronger. And then finally, you have Raylana, the Twin Moon Knight. She is the final boss for the first zone, and you must defeat her to progress through to the next area of the DLC. and she is no joke. She is the second of only 2 enemies in the whole session I had to bow out of after a couple of tries so that I could go and focus on other areas. From what I could tell, she has 3 phases, gaining some absolutely insane abilities each time she transitions. Her movement reminds me a lot of Morgoth. She likes to slide around, so you have to be on guard from all angles at all times. And eventually, when you whittle her health down enough, she will buff both of her swords, with fire and flame in one hand and what looks like frost in the other. At this point, she gains some insanely cool attacks, huge AoEs, and very far-reaching ranged abilities as well. And then, in Phase 3, she starts teleporting up into the sky and throwing down flurries of full moon spells at the ground, which impact her whole arena. And you have to time your jumps perfectly to dodge them all, because if you get caught in one, it's game over. She's fast, she's tanky, she hits hard, and she's got a huge array of abilities. It's a proper welcome to the DLC, this is what you're in for kind of boss. And at this point, I have no obligation to shout him out, but I would like to give a huge shout out to Smotown. We were side by side during this play session, and he had a lot more patience with R'Ellana than me. He was within inches of killing her multiple times. He had gathered quite a crowd, and we were all rooting for him to kill her by the end. It was to his own detriment, because it meant he couldn't explore quite as much as he wanted to, but he was so determined, and you've got to respect the hell out of that. It was really cool to see. So if you do enjoy your lore content, go and check out Smotown. We've been to a few of these IRL events together now, and we tend to spend the whole time together. I have such a good time with Smo IRL. He's a great guy. Go check him out. Go subscribe to him. That was it for all of the bosses I encountered during our time with the DLC so far, but there is also many elite enemies, such as the Black Knight Commanders, Troll Knights, and even giant Kung Fu Birdmen. There is definitely very intimidating threats waiting around every corner to test even the most hardened of Souls veterans. Next up, of course, I can't talk about all of these gameplay and combat related topics without mentioning some of the new enemies in the game. In this first area alone, there were more than a dozen new enemy types. The first one people of course will be very excited to hear about are these weird giant spectral worms. Similarly to the jellyfish, mostly they are passive and docile when you meet them. However, the occasional one can aggro, and obviously if you attack them, they become aggressive. Their upper body and their heads turn red, and they swell up to about 20 times their original size, and then they start spewing these spectral tendrils at you. They are not a threat by any means, but they tend to be in huge packs, and if you piss off one, you'll piss off a lot of them. And as they drop a fairly minute amount of runes and they are initially passive, it's probably best off to just leave them be, because they're pretty cute in their normal form as well, to be honest. There is of course many variations of bandits and soldiers walking around. Some of them are patrolling, some of them are in camps, some of them are in castles. Very typical of what we're used to seeing around castles in the base game, but of course they've got new weapons, they've got new armor variations, so they feel fresh while still being standard humanoid enemies. There is also new souped up versions of the Carian Troll Knights. These things can be absolutely devastating with tens of thousands of HP and very capable of two-shotting you if you aren't careful. Certainly the elite enemies in the DLC have been ramped up drastically, and almost all of them must be approached like a mini-boss. Another great example of this is this horned knight who wields a curved greatsword. He seemed resistant to pretty much all damage types, and even though he only had a few thousand HP, he hits hard, he knocks you over with every attack, and because of his resistances, I was barely able to scratch him with any of my attacks. There are definitely many tough elite enemies awaiting around every corner for you in the Shadow of the Erdtree. Also, as I've already mentioned, you can encounter grave birds. I wouldn't say these guys are as powerful or as annoying as the birds right at the end of the base game, who not only have knives on their feet, but can also breathe fire. They are still the most terrifying birds I have encountered in this game. The grave birds in comparison really aren't that scary to go up against. But just like any similar enemy, such as the other types of birds, and especially the dogs, they can move very erratically, and if you're not on your guard, you can very easily be ganked and swarmed by them, and just not have a second to breathe, and eventually you will be chipped down. But for the most part, they're not the scariest birds we've encountered, and they're a really cool new addition, especially as you get one of them as a Spirit Ash. And the final enemy type I'll talk about in this video, just to give you an example of the variety of enemies, you've got these mini ogres as well. I don't know if they are a close relation to ogres or if they're a closer relation to demi-humans, but these guys look really cool and they can pack a punch. They are not to be trifled with, especially in packs. If you get the advantage, they're easy to stun lock. But just as with all FromSoft games, never underestimate your enemy or you will probably die. Now we move on to the quality of life improvements. This is going to be quite a short section. There's not much that needs improving. Elden Ring has a near perfect score for a reason. But one addition that I was really surprised, very pleasantly surprised to see straight away is a recent items screen. Obviously, this won't really matter to people who've already got thousands of hours in the game, but if you're a new player and you're not sure yet what's a key item, what's a note, what's a talisman, what's a consumable, sometimes flicking through all the screens to try and find the most recent map fragment or note that you've picked up just so you can read through the description can be a bit daunting and confusing. Well, now everything will sit in your recent items screen until you have hovered over it and had a look at it. And as someone who's used to not having a recent items screen, it was actually even more confusing for me at first, but it's a really good feature. Every time I purchased a note from a merchant or a new piece of armor that I wanted to read the description of, being able to just open up my inventory and it was right there in front of me instantly saves so much time in the long run. The addition of a recent items screen genuinely makes me so happy. Next up, this is a very small thing, but something I've always wanted, and a few other Souls-likes do this, is that the consumable runes you'll pick up in your inventory now tell you exactly how many runes they'll give you when you pop them. It won't just say, like, grants a large amount of runes or a vast amount of runes. It specifically says, these give you 10,000, these give you 20,000. So if you are trying to save up most of the runes in your inventory so you're not wasting them in case you die, you now know which runes you need to use to make sure you're popping the exact right amount for that level up and save the rest of them. Also, as I'm talking about runes, be on the lookout for Shadow Realm runes. This is a new type of collectible rune which will give you tens of thousands of runes when you pop it. And finally, as we've already spoken about, Torrent grows exponentially powerful throughout the DLC, with more health and survivability, meaning it's so much more viable to use him in more and more situations. And that for me is a really big plus. And now, as we move on to the environments and the atmosphere, this is a topic I could spend hours talking about just from the first small area we had access to. But I won't, because I appreciate this video is already very long, and I am planning on making a few smaller self-contained deep dive videos over the next week as well. But what I will say is the environments are absolutely stunning. In just the first area that we were allowed access to, in just the few hours we had to explore it, I experienced so many different biomes. Lakes, grasslands, waterfalls, swamps, both poison and not poison, so many different environments, all of them equally stunning and awe-inspiring. There's even one moment where you can scale the rocks to climb up a waterfall. And yes, my friends, I'm sure many people thought the same thing when I started talking about waterfalls. Is there any hidden loot behind them? Yes, there is. One of my favourite moments was standing at the foot of Elak Great Bridge in front of Castle Ensis. This was a really stunning moment. And then when I realised I was about to get bombarded by a bunch of enemies from the other side, the gauntlet, the challenge it was to run across that bridge was like the bridge to Redmane Castle times 4. That was a very cool moment for me. And along with so much more exploration and so many new environments, inevitably there becomes so many more things we can investigate and scrutinize to help delve into the lore. For instance, near the castle of Belurat itself, there is a huge jail where you will come across these giant pustulated enemies that just ooze blood. and you find out that they are actually the living flesh of the condemned, and this is the same flesh that gets stuffed into the giant jars to become jar saints. So these abominations that we are fighting, the likes of Jarbern and Alexander, they were once these before they became the great jar saints that we now know and love. And another environmental thing I will tell you is there is a completely new environmental mechanic, sealed spirit springs. You will find locked spirit springs with an unbroken seal stopping them from being used, stopping you from accessing huge areas of the game. And you will need to find and topple stacked stones to break the seals and access brand new areas. I'm so excited to find out what more the Elden Ring DLC has in store for us. This is going to be absolutely mammoth. Now let's discuss what new items, consumables, and cookbooks you are likely to find throughout the DLC. Firstly, something that makes me very happy is arcane was a bit neglected in the base game. It was the only offensive stat that didn't have an accompanying heirloom or tier. That has now been rectified. And please keep in mind, this is literally just on the first few hours of play. I'm sure there are so many more new items that I do not even know exist yet. This is just a tiny little sprinkling of the new things that you can expect in Shadow of the Erdtree, because there are loads of new crafting items and materials. There are now well-pickled versions of most of the consumables that offer you protection, affording you even greater protection from the respective status effects and elements. And alongside that, there are new cookbooks that will unlock hefty versions of throwing pots. So you can get hefty frost pots, hefty fire pots, and they're just even bigger and even badder than the throwing pots already were. And if you don't believe me, check out my consumables only run, where I beat the entire game with nothing but throwing pots. They are really damn powerful. And now, with the hefty versions, they just got even better. As I mentioned, there are more ancient smithing and somber stones to be had, so you can fully upgrade all of your weapons. There's also obviously a ton of new weapons, armor and talismans, etc. And there's actually a huge range of upgrade materials. I found everything from a smithing stone 3 to a somber stone 9. So it seems like this DLC is going to cater for every stage of your build, no matter when you decide to tackle it. I genuinely cannot overstate the size and scope of this DLC. It's going to keep us busy for hundreds and hundreds of hours. And just quickly before I move on to the conclusion, let's talk very briefly about spells. We were given 12 new spells to try out, though as with all things, I'm sure there's going to be 100+ new spells. This really did feel like just a light sprinkling of the new things on offer. And there was some very powerful spells. There's a faith spell called Wrath from Afar, and you shoot out a giant ring of light from your chest, knocking over enemies in its path. There's also upgraded versions of some fan favorites, such as Pest Threads, and a very stylish one that lets you go full crow form called Divine Bird Feathers. My favourites though had to be some of the new gravity spells. Gravity has been very looked after compared to the base game, with this new gravity orb that you can place down on the ground, and it will pulse on the ground every few seconds, drawing in enemies, and once it's pulsed 3 times, it will then explode for thousands of damage, and anyone caught in that radius is going to be devastated. Such a wide range of new spells and lots of really cool upgrades to fan favourites, and even some more underused ones as well, to hopefully give them the screen time they deserve. That's just about everything I had for you today, my friends. Don't forget, this is just the tip of the iceberg for my Shadow of the Erdtree content. So before I wrap up with my conclusion, make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned to Dom's Roundtable for plenty more Elden Ring content. And with that, I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Bandai Namco for inviting me along to this event and letting me experience the Shadow of the Erdtree in a cathedral in Paris with a giant statue of Messmer right behind me, sat next to Smowtown, defeating some of the new bosses. It was just an absolutely once-in-a-lifetime experience. I'm genuinely now envious of everyone who hasn't played the game, because you don't really know yet fully what you're missing out on, whereas I do, and I now have to sit here for another few weeks before I can play it again, and it's pain. It's true pain. You're all going to be like, cry more, at least you've played it. Shh. I genuinely cannot wait for us all to get our hands on this DLC. It's gonna be potentially the best expansion pack I have ever played for any game ever. The new bosses, the new enemies, the new weapons, the new NPCs, the new story, the new lore. It's all so incredibly well done. And that goes back to the fact that this isn't an optional extra. This isn't something that was tagged on to the end of the game just so that they could squeeze more money out of us. This had all already been written before Elden Ring even came out. George R.R. Martin already had all of this story ready to go. This has been waiting to be told for the last 2.5 years now. And now it's finally here. We can finally do that. And I'm very excited for you all to try it out, my friends. Please let me know all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments. And if there's any particular section you would like me to expand on more over the coming days. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.